Good morning and good afternoon to those joining us from Marrakesh and from around the world. My name is Marcia Eugenio, and I'm a senior fellow with Georgetown University's Collaborative on Global Children's Issues, where I'm working on a project to document and preserve U.S. efforts to eliminate child labor and forced labor. I would like to thank the Kingdom of Morocco and the ILO for hosting the 6th Global Conference on the Elimination of Child Labor, and for creating space for this important conversation on financing the fight against child labor and forced labor. We are meeting at a moment of both real progress and real concern. Since 2000, the world has made tremendous progress with more than 100 million fewer children in exploitative work. That is a remarkable achievement, and it reflects years of sustained investment, political will, and partnership across governments, worker organizations, employers, and civil society. But today, that progress is increasingly at risk. We're seeing reductions in funding for child labor and forced labor elimination efforts, both globally and at the national level. In the United States, for example, funding cuts have led to the cancellation of major USAID, State Department, and Department of Labor international programs that helped fund education, labor inspection, supply chain accountability, and community-based protection services. Their unexpected closure has disrupted long-standing partnerships and frontline work in some of the world's most vulnerable communities. And this is not just an issue in the United States. This is part of a broader global trend. Donor countries in Europe and other regions are also reducing official development assistance, scaling back funding for education, social protection, and labor rights programs that are critical to preventing child labor and forced labor in the first place. UNICEF has cautioned that these cuts in development financing could push millions more children out of school and in the coming years. And we know what that means in practice. When families lose access to education, social protection, and basic services, the risks that children are pushed into work and into the worst forms of child labor increase sharply. So the question before us today is this: what do these funding reductions mean for our collective efforts to eliminate child labor and forced labor? And what can be done practically and politically to protect and accelerate the gains we have made? We have a terrific group of experts with us to help us unpack these issues. We'll begin with a conversation on the global financing landscape. We will then have another discussion focusing on national and community level impacts of the funding cuts. We will end with a discussion of possible solutions and a brief session to answer some of your questions. So let me start with Thea Lee and Anna Darmett. Thea is a distinguished visiting practitioner at American University School of International Service and former Deputy Undersecretary for International Labor Affairs at the U.S. Department of Labor. Anna Darmett is a professor of economics at Carleton University, Norman Paterson School of International Affairs in Canada. Thea, let me start with you. From a government and donor perspective, what are the most significant shifts you've seen in how child labor and forced labor efforts are being funded or deprioritized globally?
Thank you, Marcia. It's a huge pleasure and an honor for me to be here with all of you. Good afternoon, good morning, everybody. So your question, Marcia, is so important, and I like the way you frame it in terms of not just funding, but deprioritization. And I want to talk about how these two things are connected to each other. I mean, in terms of funding, most obviously and prominently, the U.S. government under the Trump administration's second term has very visibly and defiantly defunded, as you mentioned, a huge chunk of global funding to fight child labor and forced labor, eliminating an entire agency, the U.S. Agency for International Development, but also eliminating targeted work happening at the Labor Department, State Department, and elsewhere throughout the administration. And unfortunately, this comes with other efforts, less dramatic, but equally important, pullbacks from the European Union, UK, Germany, over recent years. And so this creates basically the abdication of a lot of government efforts. And sadly, there's a demonstration effect or an avalanche impact, which is that when one government pulls back on that funding, it almost gives permission to others to do the same. And there's several issues, of course, as you mentioned. One is the primary loss of funding and the important work that won't happen. And I think on our second panel today, we're going to hear a lot more about what that on the ground impact is. The second is the loss of experienced government personnel. And I speak from experience from my time at the U.S. Department of Labor, where the cumulative experience and knowledge that our staff had about child labor and forced labor was so important, but it was also their networks and their personal relationships that made a huge difference. But the third is the weakening and the undermining of the grantees, like the International Labor Organization or in the United States, the Solidarity Center. These important organizations are laying off people and also closing offices, country offices. Some of them won't survive this loss of funding. So the loss of government funding has ripple effects throughout the nonprofit world as well. And the subgrantees to those organizations, like in Honduras, we met women in the maquiladora sector who were creating community organizations to educate their peers about child labor and forced labor. And some of that important work will not survive without funding. But I think the key point about the deprioritization is that it's not just funding cuts, but the deprioritization that is signaled by those cuts. And so we know that technical assistance is an integral element of an overall strategy and a broader plan. And part of that is the enforcement efforts that happen by governments on the ground that sometimes are undermined or slowed by the loss of US government or other donor government funding. The other is the trade pressure with a deprioritization. I think it's really important that some governments, like the US government, the European Union, are using their purchasing power to signal to other governments and to businesses that this child labor and forced labor and other labor rights battles are important. And that trade pressure is important and must continue. And second is the carrot and diplomacy, that the messages that, again, that are sent by government efforts. And for businesses, a lot of businesses do a lot of work on this front. And they're motivated by their own moral principles, by the fear of reputational damage, but they're also motivated by fear of enforcement. And so, again, all of these things go together. And I think it's really important that we remember that these efforts are all connected to each other. So when the US government pulls back or the European Union government pulls back, it has a ripple effect throughout this work. And that can be very damaging over the short, medium, and long term. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Thea, for giving us that context. Incredibly important in terms of I like the idea of the avalanche effect or impact that this funding cuts have, and also the type of impact that it's having at various levels. But let me actually turn it over to Anna. Anna, you started your career researching child labor issues in a setting of widespread funding cuts. What's the case for research? Should scarce resources prioritize direct services to help children and communities?
Yeah, thank you so much for the invitation. It's a pleasure for me to be with all of you today. In terms of research, in a time of widespread funding cuts, the question is urgent and fair. Put every scarce dollar into direct assistance for children and communities. But I would like to argue the opposite. When resources are scarce, research is not a luxury, it's actually a necessity. On child labor, cutting research is not a savings strategy, it's a risk multiplier, because it makes our remaining program dollars less targeted, less accountable, and less effective. Over the last 25 years, better data and evidence have helped cut the number of children in work by almost half globally, showing that informed action can move millions of children out of labor and into school. Research is how we turn limited budgets into outcome gains. It tells us which packages reduce child labor, for whom, and under what conditions. So we can target by age, sector, and household vulnerability. Research also tells us what doesn't work. So in a funding squeeze, the biggest threat is misallocation. Without evidence, we may scale up programs that are popular but ineffective, or withdraw from complex but high-impact areas like child domestic work or trafficking. Now, strong research goes beyond statistics. It includes qualitative work with children and families, capturing how they experience poverty, schooling, and work, and what they see as the real opportunities and risk. Only through systematic data, we can track deep structural drivers: household vulnerability, gender norms, lack of secondary school, and so on. So the social protections and education system are not just short-term fixes, but durable child labor reducing investments. So here the question is not research versus direct assistance, it is informed action versus blind spending. A small, well-designed share of budgets devoted to research can dramatically increase the impact of every remaining dollar spent on children and communities. In a context of cuts, the most responsible thing is not to eliminate research, but to align both research and service delivery around the same goal: reducing child labor, protecting children's rights, and ensuring that every dollar spent, it is a dollar that actually changes children's life. We should not lose our ability to target, to prevent harm, and to prove what works at scale. Thank you.
And I thank you so much for that very clear argument for using research to actually target, use limited resources to more effectively target issues. I really appreciate that perspective. Tia, going back to something that you mentioned earlier, which was basically what happens when the real impact of funding cuts. And I wanted to kind of focus this question more on how funding cuts affect the building of national capacity and core public system, social labor inspection, enforcement, interagency coordination, and how difficult will it be to rebuild such system once they're weakened. It takes a long time to build the capacity. And what happens when that capacity is diminished to the point when you have to just rebuild again?
Thank you so much for that question, Marcia. And it's such an important question. Done right, international funding is most effective when it is supplementing and catalyzing efforts of a willing government. So governments, can do that work, but a lot of times they are lacking in resources, and sometimes they're lacking in will. And one of the things that we saw over my time at DOL is sometimes U.S. aid can catalyze, even interagency debates. For example, a labor minister might need to win a battle with a finance minister over whether labor enforcement is a good thing or whether it's anti-business. And the fact that the U.S. government is there giving aid and encouraging that work to go forward can be really important. Another example, when we were working in the Democratic Republic of Congo on cobalt and child labor and forced labor in the cobalt supply chain, the government of DRC really wanted to create an effective enforcement cadre. They had almost no labor enforcement, and so they had a commitment to hire 2,000 labor inspectors, and the U.S. Department of Labor's support could help them do that more efficiently. We're not going to be able to replace it. We can't hire people in another country, but we can provide electronic case management systems. We can provide training modules and so on. And that kind of thing is really very complementary and supportive of a government that already wants to move in that direction. And it may be the catalyst, the difference between doing it and not doing it. So those kinds of efforts are extremely important. And all these efforts are long-term investments. It doesn't happen quickly. And so that's why the continuity of aid is really important. Some of these will continue on their own, others may not. So there's a loss of momentum, there's the mixed messages, and then there's the wastefulness of ending a project, particularly midstream or maybe even at the final stage. So, and as you said, Marcia, I think that's just a really important part in terms of continuity, which is that it's so much easier to end funding and to fire people than it is to get that funding back on the books, rehire people, retrain them, replace the skills and the experience that are lost. So I think, these efforts, it's not just the amount of dollars that are lost, it's the long-term impact of those dollars. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Tia. Yes, that impact is felt not just in the immediate time when the cut is happening, but for years to come. Anna, over the past year, we have heard the justification that cutting programs saved money. What are your thoughts on this? And when funding is interrupted mid-cycle, as just Thea mentioned, what are the long-term implications for outcomes and cost effectiveness compared with the short-term savings often cited?
This is a very important question. I think over the past year, we've heard a lot, a familiar justification. Cutting these programs save money, which on a spreadsheet, that's technically true. Canceling a program does eliminate a budget line. But this is an accounting statement, not an outcome statement. It counts only what's safe today and ignores everything that's lost tomorrow in education loss, health harms, lower productivity, and higher protection and enforcement burdens. And this is something that Thea mentioned as well. Many child labor relevant programs generate returns over time. So there is a lot of investment today into education, awareness program, but the payoff is not today, it's in the future. So judging these programs only by this year's fiscal savings systematically bias decision towards cuts. Middle circle interruption doesn't just pause progress, it can reverse it because households respond immediately to lost income support, lost services, and lost predictability, often by increasing children's work and reducing schooling or training services. So just to give you an example, I think everybody's familiar with conditional cash transfers. I was reading a recent working paper, and they show this is in Mexico, Progresa Prospera program. This is the world's longest running conditional cash transfer, and the program ended unexpectedly in 2019. And this research shows that among high school age boys, there was a 12 percentage points drop in enrollments and an 8 percentage points increase in employment in areas where the program was widely implemented. So these effects are large or larger than the original gains, meaning that 2 decades of investments were underdone. And this is what it may happen with all the programs if we just start cutting programs. So what is the lesson? In my view, that child labors are not like infrastructure. You can't build a bridge, half a bridge, and then come back later. When you interrupt mid-cycle, families make irreversible decisions. Children drop out from school. They may end up in the worst forms of child labor or hazardous type of activities. So if we care about value for money, the right question is not did we save money today or this year, but what outcomes did we give up and what will be the cost to recover them? So we need to protect the most cost-effective components, avoid the stop and start funding when possible, as Thea mentioned, and use monitoring and evaluation to identify which cuts are the less damaging today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna and Thea, for, again, reminding us about the importance both of research, but of continuity of financing, kind of like making a long-term investment on the things that you actually care about. That is not something that you can just decide today we're no longer funding something and like pretend that that's not actually having an impact on communities, on workers, on children. So thank you so much for giving us that context, especially as we turn to our next set of speakers to have a discussion of the national and community level impact of the funding cuts. We have an amazing panel, Sean McDonald, who is the Chief Executive Officer at Verité, Sadishka Nepal, Director of Advocacy and Communications at Goodweave International, Maro Guerrero, who is the Regional Coordinator for Desarrollo y Autogestión, DYA, and Sara Dikish, the Director of Policy and Partnership at the International Cocoa Initiative. Sean, I'm going to start with you. Verité is one of the most effective organizations working to address labor abuses in global supply chains. But over the past year, you and so many other organizations have seen projects suddenly terminated. How do you see these funding reductions affecting work on supply chain transparency, worker protections, and remediation efforts at the operational level?
Yes, thanks, Marcia, for including me. And indeed, this these funding cuts have had devastating effect on our work in many parts of the world, but also those of so many of our colleagues and partners at unions and civil society organizations, as well as the IOM and ILO and others that have already been mentioned. What I want to do is kind of draw back a little bit and think about these effects kind of on the three main pillars of labor rights protection and promotion that we work on and the way we look at it. First is around data and research. And obviously, this whole ecosystem really relies on good, independent, up-to-date research and other forms of data to help everybody figure out what needs to be done, not just where there are risks, but how to make real improvements. The other really is funding that goes toward working with the private sector, so people, whether they're buyers or suppliers, business associations, and so on, can figure out how to do things differently. There's no shortage of problems that people are very well aware of, but investment needs to happen in real solutions. And importantly, transparency and scaling of those solutions. And the funding that came from groups like the US Department of Labor and US Department of State and others was always predicated on sharing publicly that information. So that's really been a big loss. And then finally, in the enabling environment, whether it's building up unions and other types of worker organizations so workers can collectively push for their own rights, and obviously for governments to be able to enforce rule of law, there's been real devastating effects there. So many things as we think of where we need to make effort, and all those three pillars have been lost, whether it's building out new types of grievance mechanisms, whether it's teaching workers about their rights and how to voice them and push for their own protections, or whether it's keeping track of new technologies around supply chain tracing, things like that in the private sector. Those are the kinds of things where this funding went to in the past, and without them, we'll really be at a loss.
Thank you, Sean, for that. I mean, you raised an excellent point that is not just, there is an important work going on in terms of trying to protect workers and from exploitation, but that the investment that is being made through these programs are also kind of supporting the efforts of good businesses that actually want to do the right thing and perhaps do not have the right set of tools and knowledge to be able to do that. So what risks do you see these funding gaps posing for responsible businesses trying to meet due diligence expectations, particularly those expectations that are already here in the United States through the Tariff Act of 1930 or the Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act, or the new legislation in Europe with the forced labor regulations and due diligence regulations there. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, definitely. So I think it's really a historic moment where we're moving from soft law to hard law. You mentioned those import bans on goods made with forced labor, also the mandatory human rights due diligence coming out of the European Union. And many other major economies are considering both those kinds of inputs. And frankly, businesses have always relied on the kinds of programs that the funders have financed in the past, particularly from ILAB at US Department of Labor, to understand where their risk is, but as I said before, also look to models that have been piloted carefully and have been evaluated carefully and then promulgated to see what they should do, which they should copy, what leadership efforts they can emulate. So that's super important. I think what's going to happen is we're going to see businesses rely on old, stale data because new research isn't being financed. Most importantly, I think we're going to see artificial intelligence recycling old, stale data and perhaps not well analyzed data, because all of the groups that know these situations best on the ground that can be providing and creating new data will not be able to do that. So there's a big risk there that companies will be relying on bad data and just relying on AI to give them advice that's not well documented. And I think also with the shift to mandatory human rights due diligence, there's the risk that companies will just stick with the status quo because there won't be new pilot projects, there won't be new toolkits, open source toolkits to help them do it. And then thirdly, with government, there's more of a pressure on governments to manage these regulations. And if they don't have good information, if they don't see how they can best push the field of due diligence, then they'll sort of accept old status quo. So it'll be a lost opportunity.
Thank you, Sean, for reinforcing again those same point that Anna was making about the importance of continuing to collect data and information and making sure that we're making decisions based on good evidence. Really appreciate that perspective. Sedisha, Goodweave, formerly known as Rollmark, has been working to eliminate child labor for 30 years. Given this long-term perspective, how do you see funding cuts affecting prevention efforts that keep children in school and out of exploitative labor?
Thank you, Marcia, for having this phenomenal panel. I think the answer to that question is twofold. It's around rules and it's around resources. In the countries where Goodweave operates, in South Asia at least, legal frameworks are largely in place. There is an understanding at the federal level around child labor, what it entails, root causes. However, what we do not see enough of is the resources on sustainable ways to implement those rules through enforcement, capacity building, implementation, and programs to address root causes. Resources for long-term prevention programs are essential to making those rules, legal frameworks, rules under trade and frameworks and enforcement work in practice. And with the funding cuts, those resources are being more precarious. If the rules are the stick, then the resources are the carrot. So we need to determine who is going to pay for the carrots and to make these long-standing investments to support the rules that are in place, right? In prevention work, it costs a lot of money. It does. There is, strengthening of the school, infrastructure for students, capacity building for teachers. It's an entire community effort when we're talking about preventing children from going to school. But Goodweave, as we work in both prevention and on remediation, one thing is for certain, remediation costs more money. Remediation is very, very costly. It is always better to have long-term prevention programs to keep children out of labor. However, without these resources to do the work up front, we will see a greater reliance on remediation to reintegrate children into the communities, which is a lot more expensive and ultimately a lot more damaging for families and communities. So the answer is to figure out these resources of how do we do prevention work and who is paying for this? The government that we work with clearly are under-resourced. So is it other governments? Is it philanthropy? Is it businesses that are going to keep the scaffolding of the work that has now eroded intact?
Thank you, Sedishka, for that. I mean, that really, really important reminder that it's more difficult to do remediation and more expensive than to do prevention. And again, looking at this investment as a long-term investment, not just an immediate policy or an immediate service that is being provided to a child or a community. Another question for you, giving Goodweave's experience on the ground and something that we want to hear and try to kind of differentiate between all of us having this conversation from a high-level policy perspective. How do children and caregivers experience these funding cuts differently than how policymakers might anticipate?
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic question because when we talk about preventing child labor, I think the understanding, at least from policymakers, can sometimes be one-on-one, like children in schools by building more schools, keeping one child in one school. But the unintended consequences of doing preventative work is a lot more far-reaching and a lot more deeper than that. In order to keep one child in school, you have to include community awareness programs, gender empowerment programs, equity programs. You need to do advocacy on the local level and with the national national leaders. You are trying to change not just the life of the child, but you're just trying to change the imagination of the entire community under which this framework operates. Then you have these unintended consequences of a child actually coming home from school and teaching his sibling or his parents, being a leader for the next generation of children in their community. We have child parliaments in areas where we operate. They then become the leaders that teach other leaders in their community. So when we think about, children and caregivers, the preventative programs goes on for generation and has a lot farther reach than one child enrolled in one school mechanism. When you cut funding, and you cut funding so abruptly as we've experienced, the consequences of it is also a lot more far-reaching. You're not just impacting one child and keeping that child out of labor, you're impacting the entire community, the families, the siblings, the network under which this community empowerment advocacy operates. And you're impacting trust. Trust takes a really long time to maintain. GoodWeave has been working in the communities where we work for more than 3 decades. And it has taken us a very, very long time to build that trust. And so when that trust erodes, starting again is something that, we might not anticipate here, but surely is happening on the ground.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. We're going to continue the same conversation with Mauro. Mauro, given DYA work in eliminating child labor and forced labor in Latin America, can you share a concrete example of a community program that had to change or close due to funding reductions and what that meant for families on the ground?
Thank you, Marcia, for having me and for giving us the opportunity to share the perspective from the ground. I will need hours to bring examples on the impact on the ground. The impact was global, affecting not only child labor eradication programs, but also other initiatives that contributed to improving the lives of vulnerable children and families. At the time of the abrupt announcement, we were implementing the Catalyst project together with the Global March against child labor in Peru, aimed to strengthen governmental tools to address child labor and to develop a strategy for the agricultural sector supported by DOL. Years of effort lost. In Argentina, we were promoting the sustainability of a due diligence system focused on child labor with the government and with companies. But suddenly their commitment got weak. The pioneer country roadmap was not mandatory anymore, and the European regulations were postponed so companies won't have the urgent to show traceability. However, by far, the worst impact occurred on the programs that offered direct services in the communities. With PRM support, we were implementing in Peru and in Ecuador a program to include vulnerable and migrant children at school and to prevent child labor. We had planned different strategies, reintegration strategies for those children that were out of school, leveling programs for overage children, academic support for primary and high school. More than 14,000 children were part of the initiative. We received an abrupt suspension order, and later we were allowed to continue. We were the only ones that were allowed to continue, but the damage was already been done. In just a few hours, we were forced to terminate hundreds of teachers and staff contracts, losing institutional knowledge built over decades. Highly mobile families were gone, families that suffer multiple compounding impacts as other support organizations also disappear. A significant portion of the school year was lost. Since our resources were limited, we had to prioritize the most vulnerable children, those whom future it will be definitely compromised. We had to adapt services. We kept some educational inclusion strategies, and we left behind occupational training programs for more than 600 adolescents. Sure, they came back to work with less hope and opportunities. The educational inclusion program was supported in specific agreements with more than 50 schools. How could we explain them from one day to the other that everything was over? How could we explain the parents that it's over? And mainly, how to explain a child that we convinced him to come back at school, that he was trusting on his teacher. He said goodbye on Friday, and on Monday, he arrived to school and he realizes that he's out of school again. Is incredible. We don't understand how. To sustain these prioritized services, we relied on our savings, on our institutional savings, and volunteering our staff. We donated part of our salaries, and we continue doing so. We presented more than 70 proposals, and we won only small projects that are not enough to support the huge emergency that has happened. Today, the significant share of our time and energy is divided between the implementation and the resource mobilization. This is our story, but it's also the story of hundreds of organizations of the Global South. Some of them already disappeared. Thank you, Marcia.
Mauro, it's heartbreaking to hear the impact on the ground that this disruptions, how disruptive the funding cuts have been. Sidishka actually mentioned this earlier, this issue about trust. And when you're working in a community, it takes a lot of time to build that trust so that a child will say, yes, I am going to leave work and go to school. Or a mother decides that, yeah, we're going to take a risk and perhaps not have something to eat for a couple of weeks until we can get some support and put the child back in school. How are the funding disruptions affecting the trust between organizations and community from the perspective of DYA?
One thing is a process where funds are decreasing gradually, because we have to accept that before the crisis, child labor has been losing momentum after a period of sustained investment. But other thing is an abrupt and arbitrary shutdown without explanation, without time to prepare the transition. We had to put our face to assume the responsibility for decisions we didn't make and we didn't understand. With parent institutions and with government, it was fairly easy to explain since they are part of the same ecosystem. Even so, we were forced to default on commitments and agreements with legal and economic consequences in some cases. Some governments had the perfect justification to put suspiciousness on the NGO's work. What did the organization to get this suspension? We have been working, as you said, decades on the ground, and communities trust on us. We have a close relation. But it was far harder to explain the inexplicable. A global and political context that is far removed from people's daily life. With the adolescents, we need another chapter. We invested a lot of time convincing them, again, to leave their jobs, to attend to our technical training programs. And 3 days later, because we have just started the programs, we were saying there is no more training program. We are teaching them to not to trust in the adults' voice. We as adults, we failed. More than a loss of trust in DYA, what was broken, and I want to make a point there, What was broken was the trust in the broader system. It's like a major banking crisis. Trust in the entire system collapses, and rebuilding it becomes very, very difficult. It's very hard to operate where we don't know which are the rules. Everything is uncertain and unpredictable. How do we know this is not going to happen again? How do communities can trust? Restoring the general trust will be the major challenge, I think.
Thank you, Maro. I think you started to touch a little bit on this, which is a question that I also asked Shadiska, and we actually got good brief's perspective on this. But I want to hear your thoughts on how children and caregivers experience these funding cuts differently than policymakers might anticipate. I think you talked a little bit about, perhaps it was easier to have discussions with governments about the funding cuts because they are part of that ecosystem, but how hard it was to kind of have that conversation with families or with youth, with children, and try to not lose all that trust that you've built over time.
More than trust, because I talk about trust in the communities, I would like to reflect on the role of the government. I think they were not ready for this emergency. DYA programs are designed to close gap where public policy is absent, is weak, or fails to reach the ground. We were developing strategies to enable the state at different levels to step in. We began by making the problem of child labor visible, to showing the relation between migration and child labor, putting in place innovative strategies through due diligence systems, focus on child labor, engaging the private sector. But suddenly, new problems started to emerge or deepen due to the lack of support of the social programs. Communities were in the middle of the emergency, and the governments couldn't react in a timely manner. We feel it's polemic, but that for some government, it was such a relief not to have to address the problem. The international agreements were no longer in force, and they were able to state explicitly that child labor was not a priority. They could say without consequences. That was the perfect excuse. In addition, many specialized teams and public officials with technical expertise on the issue were dismissed at different levels, at the US government as well as in the national governments. Some public programs to address child labor were freezed, such as Buena Cosecha program in Argentina that we were coordinating with to implement the due diligence system, with no longer consequences, despite it was part of the roadmap of a pioneer country strategy. Thank you, Marcia.
No, thank you, Maro. It is important to hear the perspective, because I think some of us were working from a policy context, kind of understand, a little bit of what the funding crisis has done in Washington or in London or in Europe, but it is difficult to hear in some ways how it has been received in at the national level and a community level, and it's incredibly important to take in that experience and kind of like perhaps readjust our own thinking on this issue. So thank you for sharing that. I am going to move to ask Sarah a question, a couple of questions given the perspective of an organization that works as a multi-stakeholder initiative. So Sarah, how are funding reductions affecting coordinated sector-wide approaches to addressing child labor in the cocoa sector?
Yes, and good afternoon, everyone, and also thank you for inviting ICI to this important discussion. So here I will maybe distinguish between the different indeed funding streams, public and private, and how they also come together. And cuts are on the public side, if I start with that, indeed impacting individual programs, individual initiatives, but also collective efforts. So on the individual program side, and that's it's aligned with what has been shared before. Also in cocoa in West Africa, we see, program cuts or cuts in programs or initiatives that were aimed at improving child protection system through strengthening social centers, for example, access to health, several NGO programs and others in the area of health, nutrition, community development being cut. So obviously it has a direct impact on efforts in cocoa growing communities. But I think there is also less appetite. I don't think there is tangible data on that, but we observe also less appetite for collaborative programs, let's say pooled funding programs that brings together companies, donors, governments, etc., which have been seen as quite promising to address, again, social services and social protection issues at scale, to be able to expand the access to healthcare services at scale, or also to help aligning private and public child labor monitoring and child labor protection schemes. So on that, indeed, we see I don't know if it is blocked, but at least indeed more difficult appetite. So less funding specifically on child labor and forced labor directly, but also less funding to address the root causes in an indeed collaborative and aligned manner. And that maybe brings me to the other side of the private funding and how that also meets then the public funding. So on the private side, at least from our perspective, we see that although one could have expected that the lower regulatory requirements with all the omnibus saga at the EU level and the uncertainties it brought would have determined the readiness of companies to invest in human rights due diligence processes and systems. So far, we don't necessarily see that because still legislation are coming, and there is still scrutiny on that. So I think we see a readiness and a continuous readiness of companies to invest in having the right systems in place, making sure that they are continuously improved. So we see that there is where the companies have a direct grasp and a direct responsibility, also legal responsibility throughout their supply chain, that is sort of ongoing. However, indeed, what is more difficult and today a bit blocked is how that can meet more larger prevention and remediation efforts. There are two examples that have been quite successful, which could have been, in an ideal world, expanded. So if I take the example of SCALE, which is the System Change Architecture for Learning Excellence project launched by the Jacobs Foundation. So it's a private foundation. Indeed, it's not donor money, it's private foundation, but the model is interesting and could be a good example of what could have been envisaged in other areas, also through public funding. So it's a project that is set up in partnership with the Ghanaian Ministry of Education in a consortium with a number of industry companies, so cocoa and chocolate companies, but also philanthropic partners such as UBS Optimus Foundation or the Fondation Botnar. And they collectively raised $40 million to fund the initiative, which unlocked an additional $40 million from the Global Partnership for Education's Multiplier Fund. So it has been launched in May last year. So I think they are still in the process of setting it up properly. So today we don't necessarily have data on its impact, but it builds on a previous successful model, which is CLEF, also initiated by the Jacobs Foundation. So CLEF stands for Child Learning and Education Facility, and the model is similar. And this project, this time led or in partnership with the Ivorian government, helped, to support the construction of school infrastructure, training teachers in effective pedagogical practices, engaging parents and their children's learning, etc. So ideally, we would have hoped to see similar type of collaborative programs, pooled programs on other issues, again, access to health, reinforcing social protection schemes. But today that's indeed difficult. And while there is an appetite, I think, from companies to look into pooled funding where there are needs, of course, it is also difficult when, it cannot be met by other means. And that's indeed difficult when governments face challenges, as I think Tia mentioned earlier, they are not necessarily matched with additional donor money. So this catalyst effect doesn't happen. And now we are a bit in a, let's say, blocked situation. So in that regard, we see that indeed collaborative approaches are, let's say, on sleeping modes, although we would have expected those to happen because they are needed to indeed reach impact at scale.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for that very comprehensive response. I have a very quick question for you. You started responding to this as well, but what challenges arise when multi-stakeholder initiatives face uneven or short-term financing and community-level projects are not being supported at the same level? So it's more of the impact that is happening on the ground. And you alluded to this in the sense that the public-private partnership projects that you have are not necessarily addressing problems at scale. So any disruption could have a significant impact. Could you comment briefly on that point as well?
Indeed. So as a multi-stakeholder organization, I think then it also depends on the business model. Our core activities are delivered through the core funding, which was membership fees. So in that sense, we are anyway sort of limited and protected. But indeed, anything else we can do collaboratively in partnership with others, bringing together private and public actors to look into more collaborative programs, which looked like indeed a promising approach not that long ago, is becoming more challenging today, indeed. And of course, we see a number of our members and partners being more directly impacted that also had to stop projects. So it also limits their opportunities to collaborate, to address jointly specific issues. So I think it's really this public-private collaborative model that is not necessarily meeting its expectations today.
Okay, thank you so much, Sarah. We were running a little bit behind, and I have one final question for our panelists. So I'll ask all of you to give me like a response that is 1 minute or less. It's an important one, though, because I think you're giving us a lot of information about the challenges that we're facing at the community, at the national level. But we want to hear your thoughts also on solutions. So the question for all of you is, if you could prioritize one financing action that governments, donors, or businesses should take in the next year to protect progress against child labor and forced labor, what would that be and why? So we're going to start with Tia. So Tia, you have 1 minute for a very difficult question. So give us your solution or what you will see ideally to help address some of the challenges that we're facing today.
Okay, thanks. It's amazing panel. Just thanks to everybody for being here. So first, I'm going to give a couple, but I'm going to do it in a minute. Governments should keep enforcing the child labor and forced labor provisions in their trade agreements. Policy continuity is really important, and enforcement is essential even if the aid doesn't continue. On businesses, please keep prioritizing genuine supply chain transparency and accountability, especially through work that centers unions and worker-driven organizations like the Fair Food Project. Political wins come and go, but you know in your gut that this work is essential and that your stakeholders will continue to expect you to step up. And for donors, please support those worker-driven democratic organizations, especially unions, so they can weather the political changes and have legal and financial resources to fight back and survive. Because in the end, what matters is changing the balance of power and giving voice to the voiceless. Thanks.
Outstanding. Thank you so much, Thea, for a very comprehensive answer in 60 seconds. Anna, over to you.
Thank you. Yes, from the research perspective, I mean, with a limited budget, I would like to finance projects in which we don't have information or evidence, but that's not the case in today's situation. So I think in terms of research, we need to prioritize the projects that we know works. So for example, the evidence base is unusually clear. We did a meta-analysis showing that conditional cash transfer reduce the odds of child labor in different countries. So we need policy continuity instead of starting new things that we don't know if they are going to work or not. Now, I think, in my view, this is the perfect moment to look at new funding partnership models. Private foundation, public-private partnership, look at the global supply chain, corporate social responsibility, and look at shared responsibility for funding models so that we are not just reliant on one source of funding, but actually we make all actors engage in reducing child labor in developing countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. I think you already answered one of the questions that we have from the audience, so that's great with that answer. So why don't we move on to Sean?
Sure. We're often advised to follow the money. And I think when we're talking about funding, we should step back and look at the hundreds of millions of dollars that are spent by the private sector in due diligence and risk assessment activities, right? On human rights, labor, as well as environment. And so unless we figure out how to get those that are regulating companies and the governments to shift that spending towards better risk assessments and, most importantly, more impactful solutions, so that when they have to do mandatory stakeholder engagement, for example, they are working with rights-based groups on the ground who can best advise them, but that will also give funding to those kinds of groups. So I think it's really important to shift that spending rather than, in addition to thinking of how we can get governments and NGOs and foundations to be doing more, because there's already a lot of money in the business sector, but it's not going toward particularly impactful things. So that's where I would invest.
Thank you so much, Sean, for that. Again, I think you helped address one of the questions that we got. Sarah, over to you for this question.
Well, I would have said pool funding, but now also in the current context, I would say cash transfers. It has been alluded to before, and I think several reports, including from the ILO, consider cash transfer as one of the most promising ways to address child labor. And we have also piloted and analyzed cash transfer programs, and our experience also working with members see also this as a promising kind of solution. We see a real potential in child labor reduction, especially in the context as the one we are in, and especially also when we have to see how to increase people's livelihood outside or beyond things that are out of our control, such as, economic realities that impact the price, etc. So we see cash transfer as quite a promising thing, at least to invest into. And the more companies implement effective cash transfer programs, because they also have to be done in an effective way to really lead to a decrease in child labor and not an increase, but the bigger the impact at scale across the sector, which in return reinforces also the need for private and public collaboration.
Thank you, Sarah. Sadisha, over to you.
I agree with everything everybody has said, but from our perspective, it would be to dissuade companies, philanthropy, government from having project to project type of funding, but instead a sustained funding mechanism for organizations that have been doing prevention, root causes elimination, economic injustice, climate, migration type of work that is long-term. We need long-term investments in organizations, as well as long-term investments in communities, and going from project to project to project, kind of sometimes how you fall into that category cannot lead to long-term solutions. So,
great, thank you so much for that. Maro, over to you.
Thank you, Marcia. The cooperation scenario has changed a lot. Economic impacts and revenues are more valuable than social impacts. We know that if we don't close social gaps, it's difficult to get revenues. The international cooperation and lately the philanthropists are prioritizing quick interventions with immediate and economic impact. We know that eradicating child labor, it's a process that takes time because it's a social problem that can't be measured in terms of revenues only. Why should we change the strategies that were working well and were successfully reducing child labor? I don't really understand. In terms of action beyond financing, there's a need to rebuild fundamental agreements that are now being called into question. Civil society, NGOs, universities, and communities must mobilize and bring child labor again as a momentum. If we have to prioritize an action, we definitely will prioritize direct intervention on the ground where local NGOs from the Global South are working in. Those organizations we are far from the places where resources allocations are defined. We are in the South. We are not getting these kind of alliances to access those resources. This is an emergency. If we don't be active to address this emergency, we will compromise a complete generation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maro. We had a number of really great questions come in, including some that some of you already touched on related to multi-stakeholder initiatives and different strategies for funding. There's one in particular that I thought may be helpful to go back to. And the person asked, how can we take advantage of this moment to advance participatory and locally led approaches to address child labor and forced labor? And if I could add to that question, which is, what is the role that workers and worker organizations should be playing at this moment in helping to advance this? So I'm going to go back. Maybe I'll start again with Thea, if you can kind of touch on this issue, and I'll kind of maybe ask a couple of you for your thoughts on this one as well.
Yeah, thanks, Marcia. I think this is a really great moment to decentralize. If we're having this lack of big donor funding from the big governments that had been traditionally and historically interested in this. But really the key thing is catalyzing local movements and local activist organizations and making sure that they're protected from reprisal or retaliation or government repression. So I think some of that can be done with less resources. And when it's effective, that is how you build lasting change, by giving voice to activists and workers on the ground. So I think that's a great moment, and it's something that I think especially philanthropy can lean into, because they're still there. Governments may have pulled back, but philanthropy, this is a good moment to step up, and those dollars can be really impactful.
Thank you, Thea. Let me, Sidisha, I'm going to ask you a question about what advocacy strategies can direct limited funding to the Global South. So what can we be doing from an advocacy perspective?
And I know that we want to think more positively of the moment that we've been handed on. And so I think this is a really crossroads of thinking how we can do things differently, how the mechanisms that were working in the past are not going to take us forward. So what do we leave behind? What have we learned? And what do we take forward? And I think on the advocacy front from our organization, at least what I see as a moment is to elevate voices of people that have been in the front lines, our organization, our survivors. We have one here in Morocco, for example, for their stories to come out, for them to communicate to the world how have these programs changed lives? How have these programs affected their communities, their livelihoods, and the choices that were handed to them? So I think a lot more survivor-led, a lot more community-led voices to come forward. This is a moment for us to highlight that. And then also on the funding end from philanthropy as well, to really champion causes, long-term root causes prevention on the ground. I think those are the two key points I would like to take away from this.
Great. Thank you so much for that. I have one final question that I wanted to ask, perhaps Sean to comment on, and it was, what are the important actions that corporations should take if child labor is identified within their operations or supply chains, given this moment?
Okay, so there's a wide variety of things that they can and should be doing, first of all, based on a lot of the good work that many organizations, including those on this panel, have been doing for many, many years. So I think first, it's not trying to start from scratch on your own. I see many companies that sort of panic when they find child labor in their supply chains and don't necessarily start with talking to the experts who really know the right principles to base a program on, but then can give some really helpful suggestions for how to do it. I think it's really important to reach out to work with other companies, because usually where child labor is found, they're not going to be the only buyer from that particular supplier. And so it's going to be hard for them to muster all the leverage needed to really make a change, particularly a change that includes the wide variety of stakeholders, including local and state and national governments that can focus on the root causes. So I think it's more in the how they do something, less than one particular silver bullet. And so it's working together. It's with other stakeholders, really relying on those most trusted voices in the community that know how to do it, and cooperating with others and holding other businesses accountable. I think businesses are sometimes afraid to call each other out on things, and they just get stuck and feel victimized, unfortunately, which is kind of crazy, but feel victimized that they're the ones that have been caught when they know that their peers are doing it. So they can get more creative and encouraging and compelling their peers, as well as governments that businesses often have a lot of connections to step up and do more.
Thank you so much, Sean, for that response. We're coming close to the end of our time together. I'm incredibly grateful for what you've all shared, for your perspective. You've given us a lot to think about today. And at a time when funding for development assistance, especially for child labor and forced labor elimination, is under real pressure, we heard from you some clear, practical ideas of how we can keep this work moving forward. I have some brief takeaways from the conversation earlier on, some of your answers to the questions. One of the first one is protect what works, right? Prioritize sustaining programs that are proven programs and partnerships that we know are successful. Integrate child labor and forced labor into broader development, education, and labor strategies. I think some of you kind of mentioned that it's important to kind of make sure that this is not like one-off type projects, or that we're kind of looking at investments, long-term investments on this issue. Invest in local institutions and worker and community organization, not as a replacement for funding, but to make investment more durable and effective. And finally, improve coordination and use evidence. I think Anna made a really great point of this, to use evidence more strategically across government, donors, civil society, and private sector, because you need good data in order to have effective strategies and policies to address child labor and forced labor. For me, a few messages are very clear. Funding cuts have a real human consequence. They mean fewer children in school, more people in exploitative work, and hard-won progress put at risk. Community resilience cannot substitute for stable financing. Communities can do a lot, but they cannot replace sustained, predictable investments from national governments and from donor countries. Financing the elimination of child labor and forced labor is a political and a moral choice. What we fund reflect what we value, whether we're serious about protecting the rights and dignity of children and workers. In closing, thank you all so much for joining us today and for being a part of this conversation. To help carry the work and the conversation that we had, we are going to summarize this discussion. We're going to share the recording, and that information will be available in the Sixth Global Conference website. We really hope that this exchange has been useful for your work, or that we will be useful for your work. This is not a one-off conversation. I think that there is a lot of room for looking at the impact of funding strategies and what work and what doesn't work, and learning from the moment that we're in. We're facing real challenges, but I feel like just from listening to all of you that our commitment is very strong, and that the people who have dedicated their lives to this work will continue to work on it. Maro, I'm taking with me that your organization and your colleagues basically volunteer to continue to do the work, that you gave up on your salaries to be able to continue to provide support to the communities that are part of your DNA. So thank you, and all the organizations on the ground that are actually doing this every day. I hope that we all leave here determined to turn this commitment into action and to accelerate the progress to ending child labor and forced labor. So thank you all so much. With this, we will end this panel. And again, thank the Kingdom of Morocco and the ILO for giving us a space to have this important conversation today. Thank you.